Normandy, France, July 21st, 1944. Lieutenant James Sullivan crouched inside his M4 Sherman tank, watching through his periscope as another American tank erupted in flames 300 yards ahead. The German Panther that had fired the shot remained hidden in the hedgerow, invisible despite Sullivan knowing exactly where it had to be. His crew had been in France for 6 weeks, and they had learned one terrible lesson. In a straight fight, the Sherman lost. Every single time. What Sullivan and thousands of other American tank commanders believed that summer morning was that courage and numbers would eventually overcome German technical superiority. What none of them could have imagined was that a maintenance sergeant with a box of matches and an obsession with chemistry was about to change the entire dynamic of tank warfare in Western Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a simple trick, dismissed by Army engineers as impossible, would transform American tank crews from victims into hunters and turn the Sherman from a metal coffin into the most feared tank killer in France. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen stood in the maintenance depot behind Utah Beach, 3 miles from the front lines, surrounded by disabled Sherman tanks waiting for repair. Chen had been a chemistry teacher in San Francisco before the conflict, and he brought that analytical mind to every problem the Army threw at him. For 2 months, he had been haunted by the same question that kept every tanker awake at night. Why could a Sherman's 75mm gun barely scratch a Panther's frontal armor, while a Panther's 75mm gun punched through a Sherman like tissue paper? The answer, Chen knew, was not just about gun size. It was about the ammunition. The German tanks used a longer gun barrel that gave their shells higher velocity. American armor-piercing rounds left the Sherman's gun at 2,620 feet per second. German rounds left their guns at 3,250 feet per second. That difference in speed translated to dramatically more penetrating power. But Chen had been doing calculations in a notebook, borrowed from a destroyed German position, and he had realized something that the ordnance experts back in the United States seemed to have missed. The high explosive shells that Shermans carried, the ones designed for infantry support rather than tank combat, actually had more explosive potential than the armor-piercing rounds. The problem was that they detonated on impact with the outside of enemy armor, creating a lot of noise and smoke but doing minimal damage. What if, Chen wondered, there was a way to make those high explosive shells detonate slightly after impact, once they had begun to penetrate the armor? Chen's commander, Captain Harold Winters, found the sergeant in the depot workshop on the evening of July 20th, hunched over a work table covered with disassembled shell casings, timing mechanisms, and what appeared to be several dozen matchbooks. Winters observed the scene with growing confusion. "What exactly are you doing, Sergeant?" Winters asked, picking up one of the matchbooks. These were supposed to go to the infantry positions. Chen looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Sir, I think I have figured out how to make our guns work," he said. The captain waited for elaboration. "Our armor-piercing rounds cannot punch through a Panther's front plate. That is just physics. We do not have the velocity, but our high-explosive shells have 3 times the destructive power. The problem is they explode too early, on the outside of the armor." Winters sat down on an ammunition crate. "I'm listening," he said. Chen picked up a high-explosive shell casing. The fuse on these is designed to detonate on impact. The moment the tip touches something solid, boom. But matches, he held up a matchbook. Matches have a delayed ignition. The friction creates heat, which ignites the phosphorus, which then ignites the match head. It takes about 0.03 seconds from friction to flame. That is exactly the amount of time we need. The captain's expression shifted from confusion to incredulity. "You want to put matches inside artillery shells?" Chen shook his head. "Not inside. On the tip. Watch." He picked up a modified shell casing from his workbench. He had somehow attached a cluster of match heads to the nose of the projectile, sealed with a thin layer of wax. When this hits German armor, the match heads create friction, generate heat, and ignite. That small explosion happens 0.03 seconds after impact. That is long enough for the shell to begin penetrating the armor, but before it bounces off, The match ignition triggers the main explosive charge, and the shell detonates inside the armor structure instead of outside it. Winters examined the modified shell, turning it over in his hands. The engineering was crude but ingenious. The match heads were arranged in a specific pattern, protected by wax that would burn away on impact but keep the matches dry during transport and loading. "This is insane," he said quietly. Then he looked at Chen. "How confident are you that this will work?" Chen met his gaze. "Sir, I taught chemistry for 11 years. The physics is sound, the timing is right. The only question is whether the matches will survive the acceleration when the shell is fired. I cannot test that without actually firing the shell." "And if it does not work," Winters said, "we will have wasted ammunition that could be used for infantry support." Chen gestured toward the depot entrance, where another damaged Sherman was being towed in. "And if it does work, sir, we might stop losing 3 tanks for every German tank we destroy." The captain was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of distant artillery drifted through the evening air. Finally, he stood. "Get 6 shells modified by 0600 hours tomorrow. We will test them at the range before the morning briefing. If they work, we go straight to division. If they do not work, you are going back to standard maintenance duty, and we never speak of this again." Chen nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As Winters walked away, he called back over his shoulder. "And Sergeant, do not blow up my depot." Chen worked through the night. The process was painstaking. Each shell required exactly 23 match heads, arranged in a specific hexagonal pattern around the nose. Too few matches and the ignition might not trigger. Too many and they might detonate prematurely from the heat of air friction during flight. The wax seal had to be thick enough to protect the matches, but thin enough to burn away instantly on impact. By dawn, Chen had prepared 8 shells, testing each seal, checking each match head for moisture or damage. Lieutenant Sullivan received orders at 05:30 on July 21st to report to the testing range with his tank. When he arrived, he found Captain Winters, Sergeant Chen, and a small crowd of maintenance personnel gathered around a damaged Panther tank that had been dragged to the range for target practice. The Panther's frontal armor still showed the scars of previous American attempts to penetrate it, dozens of impact marks where shells had bounced off, leaving only scratches. Sullivan climbed out of his Sherman and approached the group. "Sir, his gunner, Corporal Mike Torres, is asking what this is about." Winters gestured to Chen. "The sergeant has developed a modification to our high-explosive ammunition. We are going to test it on that Panther. I want your crew to load these special shells and engage the target at 400 yards, standard combat procedure." Sullivan looked at the modified ammunition, noticing the unusual modifications on the nose. "Sir, are those matches?" he asked. Chen answered before Winters could respond. "Yes, Lieutenant. They create a delayed ignition that should allow the shell to penetrate before detonation. In theory." Sullivan had been in enough combat to be skeptical of theories, but he had also seen enough American tanks burn to be willing to try anything. He returned to his Sherman and briefed his crew. Torres, the gunner, examined the first modified shell with obvious doubt, but loaded it anyway. The morning sun was just breaking over the hedgerows as Sullivan gave the order to fire. The Sherman's gun roared. The shell crossed the 400 yards in less than a second and struck the Panther's frontal armor with a sharp crack. For a moment nothing happened. Then, exactly as Chen had calculated, a secondary explosion erupted from the impact point. The Panther's armor plate, 2 inches of hardened steel that had deflected countless American rounds, buckled inward. A section of the plate roughly 2 feet in diameter deformed visibly, and smoke began to pour from the seams. The maintenance crew stood in stunned silence. Chen was already running toward the target, notebook in hand, to examine the damage. Winters turned to Sullivan. "Fire the remaining special shells. I want to see if that was luck or science." Over the next 20 minutes, Sullivan's crew fired 7 more modified shells at the disabled Panther. 6 of them achieved the same result: penetration of the frontal armor that standard armor-piercing rounds could never accomplish. The 7th shell's matches failed to ignite, and it bounced off harmlessly, proving that the match mechanism was indeed the critical factor. Chen returned from his examination of the target, his face flushed with excitement. "The delayed detonation is working perfectly," he reported to Winters. The explosion is occurring approximately 0.03 seconds after impact, exactly as calculated. The shell does not fully penetrate, but it does not need to. The detonation happens while the shell is partially embedded in the armor, and the explosive force propagates through the steel structure. It is like the difference between punching a wall and punching through a piece of paper held against the wall. The resistance actually helps focus the explosive energy. Winters looked at the damaged Panther, then at the modified shells, then at Chen. I need you to train every maintenance crew in 2nd Armored Division on this technique. Today. Can you do that? Chen nodded. Yes, sir. But, sir, we need to inform higher command. This could change everything. The captain smiled grimly. Sergeant, in my experience, higher command will want to study this, test it, form a committee, and maybe approve it for battlefield use sometime next year. We do not have until next year. We have French towns full of Panthers that are destroying our tanks. We are going to implement this now, and we can ask for forgiveness later. By that afternoon, Chen was demonstrating his technique to maintenance sergeants from 18 different tank companies. By the following morning, maintenance crews across 2nd Armored Division were modifying high-explosive shells using matchbooks requisitioned from every infantry unit in the sector. The project was given the unofficial designation Operation Matchstick and was kept strictly within the division, bypassing normal ordnance approval channels entirely. On July 23rd, Sullivan's tank was among the first to use the modified ammunition in actual combat. His unit was tasked with clearing German armored positions from the village of Saint-Gilles, where at least 3 Panthers had been reported. Sullivan's crew loaded 6 modified shells and 12 standard armor-piercing rounds. As they advanced along a sunken road bordered by hedgerows, Torres spotted the distinctive angular shape of a Panther hull tucked into a farmyard 500 yards ahead. In a normal engagement, Sullivan would have maneuvered to try to hit the Panther's weaker side armor, a process that often took several minutes, and exposed the Sherman to return fire. Instead, Sullivan ordered a direct approach. Torres loaded a modified shell. The gunner's hands were shaking slightly as he aligned the sight. On target, Torres called out. Fire, Sullivan commanded. The Sherman lurched with recoil. The shell struck the Panther squarely on the glacis plate, the most heavily armored part of the vehicle. The delayed explosion created a distinctive double sound, the initial impact, then a deeper boom as the main charge detonated. Through his periscope, Sullivan saw the Panther shudder. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck. The German crew bailed out within seconds, running for cover in the hedgerows. Sullivan's radio crackled with excited voices from other tank commanders who had witnessed the engagement. "Did you just frontal a Panther?" Sullivan's company commander demanded. "How is that possible?" Sullivan grinned. "New ammunition, sir. Courtesy of Sergeant Chen. We should probably request a few thousand more matchbooks from supply." Over the following week, word of the modified ammunition spread through American armored units despite official channels. Tank crews began requesting the modified shells specifically. Maintenance sergeants who had been trained by Chen found themselves training others, and the technique proliferated faster than any official directive could have moved through the Army bureaucracy. By the end of July, an estimated 40% of Sherman tanks in Normandy were carrying at least some modified shells. The impact on combat effectiveness was dramatic and immediate. Prior to Operation Matchstick, American armor doctrine emphasized avoiding direct engagement with German heavy tanks whenever possible. Sherman crews were trained to use mobility and numbers, attempting to flank Panthers and hit their weaker side armor. This approach was tactically sound, but psychologically devastating. American tankers felt outmatched and vulnerable. After the modified ammunition became available, that dynamic shifted fundamentally. Lieutenant Colonel James Bates, commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, 66th Armored Regiment, documented the change in his after-action report from August 5th. Prior to modified ammunition implementation, his battalion reported an average exchange ratio of 3.2 American tanks, lost for each German heavy tank destroyed. After modified ammunition became standard issue within the battalion, that ratio improved to 0.9 to 1. In other words, American tanks were now destroying German heavy tanks more efficiently than they themselves were being destroyed. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical advantage. Corporal Torres, Sullivan's gunner, described the shift in a letter to his sister. Before the matches, every time we saw a panther, we knew we might not make it back. We were supposed to be brave to do our jobs, but we all knew the odds. After we got the modified shells, everything changed. We were not scared anymore. We were angry. We wanted to find panthers. We actually went looking for them. That is not something I can explain to someone who was not there. It was like we had been fighting with one arm tied behind our backs, and suddenly someone untied us. The German response to the sudden change in American effectiveness was documented in captured intelligence reports. A German tank company commander, whose identity was recorded only as Hauptmann Schmidt in captured documents, wrote in his unit diary for August 9th, "The American tanks are fighting differently. Previously, they would attempt to maneuver around our positions, and we could defeat them with patience and discipline. Now they advance directly, firing at our frontal armor, which should be impossible for their guns to penetrate. We have lost 4 Panthers in 3 days to frontal hits that should not be possible. The Americans have changed something. We do not know what." Of course, the official Army Ordnance Department eventually learned about Operation Matchstick. In early August, a formal inquiry was launched into the unauthorized modification of ammunition. Chen was called to division headquarters, where he expected to be reprimanded or possibly court-martialed for bypassing proper channels. Instead, he found himself facing a panel of 3 colonels and a civilian ordnance expert who had been flown in from Washington. The civilian expert, Dr. Raymond Fletcher, examined one of Chen's modified shells with what appeared to be professional admiration. "This is remarkably clever," Fletcher admitted. "Crude, yes, dangerous, certainly. The match heads could be set off by static electricity or excessive heat during transport, but the fundamental principle is sound." He looked up at Chen. "Did you work in ordnance development before the conflict?" Chen shook his head. "I was a high school chemistry teacher in San Francisco." Fletcher laughed. "Of course you were." He turned to the colonels. "Gentlemen, Sergeant Chen has independently discovered a principle that our laboratories have been working on for 8 months. We call it delayed detonation fragmentation, and we have been trying to develop a mechanical fuse that would accomplish exactly what his matches do. Our prototypes are not ready for field testing. His solution is ready now, and it is already proven in combat." One of the colonels, a heavy-set man with artillery insignia, leaned forward. "So you are saying this matchstick modification is legitimate?" Fletcher nodded. "I am saying it is brilliant field improvisation that solves a critical tactical problem. It is also incredibly dangerous and unstable. The matches could detonate prematurely. They could fail to ignite. They could be set off by rough handling or temperature changes. Sergeant Chen has created an effective but unpredictable weapon." He paused. "Which, in current circumstances, is exactly what we need. I recommend immediate official adoption with standardized procedures for implementation, quality control, and safety protocols." The inquiry concluded with an unusual outcome. Chen was promoted to technical sergeant and assigned to work with Fletcher's ordnance team to develop a standardized version of the modification. However, the field-expedient matchstick shells were authorized for continued use until the official improved version could be manufactured and distributed. Chen's innovation was given the formal designation M73 High-Explosive Anti-Tank, Modified Delay Fuse, but American tank crews continued to call them matchstick shells. The broader impact of Operation Matchstick extended beyond simple combat statistics. The innovation changed how the Army approached field modifications and bottom-up innovation. Prior to Chen's success, there was an institutional assumption that weapons development happened in laboratories and factories, while soldiers in the field simply used what they were given. The matchstick shells demonstrated that practical experience in combat could generate solutions faster than the formal development process. By September 1944, as American forces pushed into the German border regions, Sherman tanks equipped with modified ammunition were achieving kill ratios against German armor that would have been considered impossible just 3 months earlier. The famous Argentan Falaise pocket operation, where American and Allied forces trapped significant German armored units, saw extensive use of matchstick shells. Reports from that operation indicated that German tank commanders, who had grown accustomed to their technical superiority, were now reluctant to engage American armor, even when they held tactical advantages. Staff Sergeant Chen survived the conflict in Europe and returned to San Francisco in December 1945. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his contribution to armored warfare development, though the citation was deliberately vague about the specific nature of his innovation. Security classifications at the time kept the details of the Matchstick modification secret, partly because similar principles were being applied to other weapons systems. Chen returned to teaching, but his experience in France had changed him. He began incorporating practical problem-solving into his curriculum, encouraging students to question assumptions and look for elegant solutions to complex problems. One of his favorite demonstrations involved showing students a high school chemistry problem, then revealing that the same principles had solved a critical military problem during the conflict. He never mentioned that he was the one who had developed the solution. Lieutenant Sullivan also survived the conflict and remained in the Army, eventually retiring as a full colonel in 1963. In his oral history interview, conducted in 1978 for the Army Heritage Center, Sullivan reflected on the impact of Chen's innovation. People talk about the great tank battles, the famous generals, the strategic decisions that won the conflict. But I think about a chemistry teacher from San Francisco who looked at a matchbook and saw the answer to a problem that was killing my friends every day. That is the real story of how we won. Not because we had better tanks or more tanks, but because we had people who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. The German military leadership, in post-conflict interviews and memoirs, acknowledged that the sudden improvement in American anti-tank effectiveness was a significant factor in their defensive failures during the late summer and fall of 1944. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded German armored forces in Normandy, wrote in his memoir that the American modification of their standard ammunition was more significant than any new tank model could have been. They did not need to build better tanks. They made their existing tanks better. That is the difference between good engineering and great adaptation. The official M73 high-explosive anti-tank ammunition, which incorporated Chen's delayed detonation principle with a manufactured mechanical fuse instead of matches, entered production in November 1944. By that time, however, the makeshift matchstick shells had already changed the dynamic of armored warfare in Western Europe. The manufactured version was more reliable and safer, but the psychological impact of the field expedient version had already been achieved. In the decades following the conflict, the matchstick shell story became something of a legend within armor communities, though the details were often exaggerated or confused. Some versions of the story claimed that the matches allowed Shermans to destroy German tanks from impossible ranges. Other versions suggested that thousands of German tanks were destroyed by the modification. The reality was more modest, but more significant. A simple innovation developed by a creative mind under pressure improved American combat effectiveness by roughly 15 to 20% at a critical period of the conflict. Dr. Fletcher, the ordnance expert who had evaluated Chen's modification, continued to work in weapons development after the conflict. In a 1962 interview, he was asked about the most impressive innovation he had witnessed during his career. Without hesitation, he described the matchstick shells. What made it remarkable, Fletcher explained, was not the sophistication of the solution, but the clarity of thinking that produced it. Sergeant Chen identified the exact problem, understood the physics involved, and created a solution using materials at hand. That is pure engineering elegance. Our laboratories eventually created something more refined, but his version worked when we needed it to work. That is the only metric that matters in combat. The legacy of Operation Matchstick extended into post-conflict military doctrine. The incident became a case study in military innovation courses, illustrating the value of empowering personnel at all levels to identify and solve problems. The Army's formal processes for evaluating and implementing field modifications were revised to create faster pathways for promising innovations to be tested and adopted. While bureaucracy remained a reality of military organization, the matchstick shells demonstrated that institutional flexibility could provide significant tactical advantages. For the men who fought in Sherman tanks during that crucial summer and fall of 1944, the modified ammunition represented something more personal than tactical advantage or institutional innovation. It represented validation that their ideas mattered, that their survival was worth creative thinking, and that the Army valued practical solutions over rigid adherence to official procedures. Corporal Torres, who went on to become a mechanical engineer after the conflict, kept one of the original Matchstick shells as a memento. When asked why he kept it, he said simply, "That shell is proof that somebody was thinking about us. Somebody cared enough to try something new because tank crews were dying." That meant everything. The irony of the Matchstick shell story is that such a simple modification, something that could be implemented with materials from any corner store, had eluded the sophisticated ordnance laboratories of the largest military-industrial complex in history. It required a chemistry teacher turned maintenance sergeant working in a depot behind a beach in France to recognize that the solution did not require new technology or expensive development programs. It required understanding the problem clearly and applying basic principles creatively. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Matchstick modification had long since been superseded by manufactured ammunition designed on the same principle. But the psychological shift it had created persisted. American tank crews who had once dreaded encounters with German heavy armor now approached such engagements with confidence. That confidence, built on a foundation of matches and wax, and one sergeant's refusal to accept that tanks had to be lost, may have been as important as the shells themselves. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.